And I know that a lot of your work is inspired by landscape and geography, and maybe that harkened back to your days in Alaska. I'm glad that we have this image of the work that is in the auction at Oceanside Museum of Art. And while we're looking at it, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, this one is called, I think it's Fruiting Body number 6. There are a whole bunch of those. When I was an undergraduate, I had a work-study job working for a botanist. I was his darkroom technician for all of his EM scope work. He took thousands of pictures of pollen grains, and I think that's where this kind of technique started. This actually looks kind of like a pollen grain, one of them, and that sort of genre has continued for a number of years.
It also has a lot of hand embroidery, and I know you do 2 stitches in particular. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, I took a workshop once to learn embroidery stitches, and it was clear from the outset that there were only going to be 2 stitches that worked for me. One is French knots. I love French knots. And the other is seed stitch, which is basically in and out in a random pattern. And people who do seed stitch will tell you that everybody has their own rhythm and their own size and placement pattern. I can't make stitches bigger than about 1/4 of an inch without really trying.
So it's embedded in your brain now, sort of an automatic dimension that just comes out of your hand. If we could see the next slide, I know along with the work that comes from the landscape, you've done a series of microbes. How did that get started?
I have had the privilege for several years of being part of an artist scientist program in Fairbanks, Alaska called In a Time of Change. The program has focused on the issues of climate change and has sort of focused in different directions. 3 years ago, the project title was Microbial Worlds. My collaborator and I, Renan Carroll, worked on, we went out to a research station with the rest of the group of artists and looked at water drops through the microscope. And that's how this whole series started. The piece that you see close up on the screen is actually some of the microbes that we looked at through the microscope, and several people drew pictures of what we were seeing. Little animals and little plants, and they're all moving. At any rate, I have subsequently continued to work in this format. All the pieces are 14 by 14, and they have that center circle as if you were looking through a microscope. The more recent ones, frankly, I make them up. I make them up as I go along.
So obviously you've spent a lot of time in Alaska, and that informs a lot of your work, but recently you were at the other end of the universe. And you had some work that that trip inspired. Can you tell us about that?
Charles and I had an opportunity to take a Lindblad cruise to Antarctica a year ago in February. One of the cool things about that particular trip is that they will offload you a couple of times a day. So the picture that you saw of me and the skua, that was just a day that we offloaded on a beach that was covered with baby fur seals and emperor penguins, and the skua. He was wandering around cleaning up things. The probably the most interesting part of that whole trip was spending 5 or 6 days around, cruising around South Georgia Island. It's more temperate than the Antarctic Peninsula, and it was summer in February, so I had an opportunity as we walked around to see plants and microbe things that were fairly similar to the things that we see in the Arctic.
So you've been bouncing back and forth between very north and very south. So I want to move us back to very north, to Alaska, and talk a little bit about Sedna's tears, if we can see that slide.
Yeah, part of, because I spend a lot of time in Alaska back and forth, I've become very conscious of the climate change issues that affect the far north, and particularly the native people right along the Arctic Ocean coast. Sedna's Tears was a piece that I developed as in response to a Studio Art Quilt Associates prospectus talking about migration. This is talking about what the indigenous people are having to do because their climate is changing in such a way that it's impacting their subsistence lifestyle. And what you see with Sedna is the Inuit goddess of the undersea. And there's a long story about how she gets there, but she controls the fishing and the whaling and the sealing that the people do. And this particular piece, which is, it's 73 inches and by 112 inches, it's a triptych. It's the biggest piece I've ever done. It's talking about, on the left side is a map, a topographic map of part of the North Slope. There's a whole lot of barrier islands out there, and because the Arctic is becoming more temperate, the ice that covers most of that area is melting, which is changing the climate and the weather. It's making the ocean more harder to navigate. There are bigger breakers on the shore, and it's just becoming more and more difficult for the indigenous people to survive in their traditional ways.
And you have another work that is coming up in Goodbye My Village that also deals with the earth not behaving the way we always would like for it to.
This is another in that series that talks about these villages are located right on the beach, and as the beach becomes less stable and the water rises, the village buildings are falling in, and most of these villages are having to consider, and several of them already have moved, as much as a mile inland to higher ground. This particular Goodbye My Village talks particularly about Noatak Village, and they've had to move. You can see at toward the top right, the village, where the village is going. It's a really powerful issue, and it makes me very sad. And so I've worked on dealing with how I feel about it by making these pieces.
And this work was juried into an exhibition that I understand is traveling for 3 years.
Yeah, it's been on tour for a year, and it will continue. I don't have the dates and the places in my head, but it will be on tour for another year and a half.
So sticking with earth and the water, you've also worked on a series of goddesses, and in fact, one of them is behind you. Want to tell us about Fog Woman and Raven?
Fog Woman is the story. It's a Northwest Coast story of how the salmon come to spawn annually. Raven is a trickster, and he wooed and won the princess, and she was able to, she's holding a basket that's a chief's hat, and she could dip her hat into the stream and fish would appear. Well, the Raven got to be lazy and not very pleasant. And so she sent him packing, and she took the fish away. And then she discovered that the people were starving. So she brought the fish back once a year so that they have to work for it. But if you go to Southeast Alaska and along the northwest coast of British Columbia, you'll often see in the summer and the fall drying fish. They catch salmon and clean them and dry them for winter food.
So what prompted you to start a series of goddesses, and where did you find the stories that you translated into fabric?
The curatorial committee of the Visions Art Museum offered me a solo exhibition at a time when other work in the museum was figurative. I decided that I wanted to pursue the ideas of legends and stories, particularly the kinds of stories that have to do with powerful goddesses who have power in their own right without necessarily having to be the consort of a powerful god. So I started doing good old Google research, and I found 5 stories that I wanted to use. The one you see now, Jiwang Mu, a friend of mine is a medieval China scholar, and she told me about Jiwang Mu, who is basically the goddess of everything. And she rides a tiger. She holds a peach, and she lives up in the mountains. I'm afraid I've forgotten most of the story. She can be either a crone, which is how I portrayed her, or a beautiful young woman. All of the stories that I translated, part of what I looked for was imagery that I could translate into a quilt, a quilt surface.
So I see you are using what looks like hand-dyed fabric and commercial fabric. And I know you use both. Do you have a preference?
You know, I don't. Well, that's not true. I do have a preference for my own hand-dyed material because it gives me an opportunity to use my own marks.
If we can see the next slide with the microbes, that's a really good example of your own marks.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that one?
This is called microbe number 19. And
how many French knots?
Oh, probably several hundred. All of those little circles are filled with French knots. I made this at the very beginning of the stay-at-home order. I had to have something to do, and the coronavirus microbe is really pretty. Horrible as it is, it's a very attractive image. And so I decided to make one of my microbes be the COVID-19. It's out of order. It will always be microbe number 19. And
for obvious reasons.
Microbe number 13.
Yeah.
And the other ones.
I want to talk a little bit, well, tell us about this, this work that's on the screen now, and then we'll talk about your book.
Yeah, this is called Meander, and it developed from an experiment, a dye room experiment, where I made the meandering river. This is a very common form of river system in Alaska. And it just sort of grew on my table, on my design wall.
And we'll see it as we walk into your dye room. I think this would be a good time to talk about this project that you undertook three-dimensionally for the show that'll open at Oceanside Museum of Art August 1st. Little plug there.
Yes, a little plug.
It's called Southern California Contemporary Quilts, and there are 36 artists. One is Charlotte, of course, which is one of the reasons we're here with her, and she's going to talk about the work that she has that will be in that show. And if we could take a look at that.
Yeah.
And tell us
Charlie is our cameraman.
How did that work come about, and how different is it from everything you've been doing?
The actual quilt pieces, the sides of the accordion are fairly similar to what I've always done. The hand cut and fuse applique kinds of imagery.
And every page is a location in Southern California.
Yes. As we have talked, most of my work has focused on the things I know about Alaska. And when you proposed that I apply for the show, I kind of went, Southern California, ooh. And then I started to think about it, and we've lived in Southern California for over 40 years, and so I really ought to start thinking about where I live. So I took a map and drew a line west to east, basically from where the Colorado River becomes the border of California and Arizona. And the bottom line is the US-Mexico border. I started to look for places I either knew or wanted to know about as I traversed from west to east. And you can see here, this is more or less Torrey Pines bluffs with a few with a little
Yes.
license. And as you go east from there, you get into, on the north side, you get into, my cameraman is, there he goes. Los Angeles, the downtown and the freeway covered Los Angeles.
So every page is quilted, but
Yeah.
how did you get them to stand up and form the skyline across the top?
The first two pieces that I did were the San Gorgonio wind farms, San Gorgonio Pass and the wind farms. And I had the two pieces actually quilted and the shape figured out. And then I realized that the way I thought I was going to stabilize them and make them stiff didn't work. So we had to, because they're very large, that's 16 inches wide and just about 18 inches tall at the tallest point.
And how long, how wide is the book?
You will remember that I first told you that it was going to be around 5 feet, and that was fine. And after I got about 2/3 of it done, I realized that no, it was going to be closer to 9 feet. And I called you and said, we got a problem, Houston. And we worked it out. Oceanside Museum is graciously making a pedestal top to fit it. And
to transport it, it all folds up.
It all folds up into a box. My maker is also my cameraman. Charlie has been my roadie and my sounding board for figuring out how to make things work. He did all of the cutting of the tops of the pages. He cut all of the acrylic pages.
And this is going to be a truly collaborative project when it's installed at the museum, because he has researched every location and has written title cards about the geography of every location that will accompany each page. So as people are walking around it and examining your fine work, they can also read the story that is part of that location.
Yeah, we both felt that while the images are pretty pictures, if you don't know what you're looking at, it loses something. What you're seeing right here is called, it's a representation of what are called the Blythe intaglios. A little ways west of Blythe, there are several of these huge forms that have been scraped out of the desert pavement. You cannot see them you can't see the whole thing from the ground. There's a wonderful video. A guy went out with a drone and took pictures of all of them. The archaeologists don't know really how old they are, anywhere from 900 years ago to who knows. And discovered until the late 1930s, when someone flew over and took pictures of them. They're out in the middle of what during World War II was an artillery range. And the remarkable thing is that most of them are intact. They're now all of them fenced.
So this departure from two-dimensional wall work to three-dimensional standing work is something relatively new in your art practice. And I understand you have almost completed, or if not completed, another three-dimensional work in your sewing room. Can we take a look at that? I'm talking about those fuzzy dice.
Yes. Once again, the idea of climate change and the issues that climate change are bringing, I had this crazy idea at one point to make fuzzy dice, like the ones you saw in your 1957 Chevy. And I was thinking about each of the faces of the dice reflect some kind of issue, climate change related issue. Right now are the bees. There's huge problems with the bees. Oh, these are photocopies of each of the sides that I pinned onto the wall. So if my cameraman can pan over to Miami Beach. And the issue, Miami is going to be flooded at some point. And the next one over is a tornado. Tornadoes are happening more and more frequently. And there you see those funny seed stitches again.
I see that, and I see some hand-dyed fabric too.
Yes. This piece, the dice have a lot of hand-dyed fabric on them. The dice are 6 inches in square. They are, it was, once again, an opportunity to learn something, to figure out how to get these quilted pieces as a skin over the cube. Yeah, this is.
So you think you're going to hang them from a rear view mirror at some point?
Yeah, we've talked a bit about how to hang them, and I'm thinking that when I am released from house arrest and can go down to one of the junkyards, I'm going to see about a rear view mirror to hang them from, because we are we're looking backwards to what it used to be, and we're looking forward to what awful things are potentially happening. I don't know where all of this is going. I'm liking working in 3D. There's something about being required to consider being able to walk all the way around it that I'm finding interesting. And as most of my close friends know, I am spatially, I have spatial problems, and I can't find my way out of a paper bag. So this is good experience.
And we're looking forward to your solo show at Oceanside Museum of Art next year.
Yes.
And there'll be three-dimensional work in that show as well?
Yes. That's an installation, going to be an installation in the Parker gallery upstairs, which is an interesting kind of cube to space to fill.
It's a wonderful, intimate space.
Yes, it's
And
a lovely space. And this one's going to be called Migration, and it talks about the annual migration of sandhill cranes north to their nesting sites in the high Arctic, and then in the fall when they fly south to the central U.S. For their wintering grounds. That the installation is also going to include a couple of quilts that talk about the birds themselves, and there's going to be a sound component. You'll get to hear the birds as they fly.
so as we leave your sewing room, and thank you very much to your camera person.
Yes, thank you to the cameraman.
You don't spend all of your time in the studio. I mean, I know you've been on lockdown for recent times, but, and your inspiration often comes from your travels. So
Yeah.
what have you got coming up that you're looking forward to?
Well, unfortunately, coronavirus has shut down all of our planned travel for the spring and summer. Today, we would be getting on a plane going to Fairbanks to start a 6-day base camp trip to the Ichilic River in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That won't happen this year. Maybe next year.
Well, and sometimes between now and your show at Oceanside, you may have the opportunity to see something that will spawn some new work that
Absolutely.
has not even come onto your draft table yet.
That's right. Yeah, nothing's safe, and ideas keep happening all the time. So stay tuned.